So you think you're safe from these things because you're not indigenous? Many people, even many people from the REZ, say that because they are outsiders, they aren't part of our tribe, can actually go wherever they please. That they are immune to these things because they aren't native. That they can hear all the stories or even try to find one of them without any consequences. I think otherwise. From experience, that is. I'll share my story with you. It is kind of sad, but I think we can all learn from it as well, whether you believe the same things as us or not. I guess this is more of a warning. The story was told by a white teacher that came from back east to teach at a boarding school in the Navajo REZ. I think he said this happened to him at Caybeto, Arizona. Back in the 70s, that is. Later, he moved into our community to teach at a local boarding school. He was an outdoorsman. He said he liked to hike a lot out on the REZ, and sometimes he would camp out overnight. He loved the great open country of the REZ. One day, while working as a teacher in his career, he became curious about a distant mesa not far from the school. While he was out for lunch that day, he mentioned it to a few locals that he was thinking about hiking it and maybe camping overnight. The reaction he got was not what he expected. He said that one of the older men slowly shook his head. "You shouldn't go up there," the man said. "That mesa, it doesn't welcome outsiders." "Outsiders?" the teacher asked, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean? You might think you're safe because you're not one of us. There's things out there, things that we don't even speak of. That mesa is not for you. It's not for anyone." That's when a woman also told him, some places are meant to stay empty. He said curiosity got the better of him, and so he chose to hike the mesa anyway. So when he got up there, he chose a campsite close to the edge of the mesa with high cliffs, and he built a big campfire. And so he set up for the night. So as the sun went down, he said it was a clear night sky, and all the stars came out. You could see for miles and miles in all directions from this mesa top. Big campfire could also be seen from miles away from any direction. Then, as he settled in, he was looking out into the big open country. He said that's when he first noticed the red light shine far off in the distance. It appeared to be moving towards him, and it was also moving pretty fast. Now, he said the space was miles long. He said the red light was blinking on and off, and every time he saw it, it was closer than before. At first, he thought it might be a vehicle in the distance, but the way it was moving, zigzagging, covering vast distances real quick, he knew it wasn't a vehicle. There's no way it could move that fast. He said it looked like a small glowing red orb. As he was watching, he said it reached the base of the cliff. It blinked out and disappeared from view. All he could do was sit there, staring, wondering what it was. He said that it could have been some light that he had read about. After all, he was a teacher. Maybe it was light being refracted from a distant source, or caused by heat waves interacting with the cold night air. A whole bunch of geeky shit like that. Now where he had set up camp was at the edge of a sheer rock cliff that actually rose a couple of 100 feet straight up. After the red light disappeared, he went back to sit by his campfire. As he continued enjoying the environment, he said he began to hear strange noises coming from the direction of the cliff's edge. At first, it sounded like wind brushing against the rocks, but then it got louder. Low grunts, snorts, and the scrape of claws on stone. He assumed it was some sort of animal, but something about it was wrong. The sounds were too heavy, almost like if something was pacing back and forth just out of sight. He said he felt his heart begin to race as the noises grew closer, and then, without a warning, an old man appeared. He was pulling himself over the cliff. His eyes were shining in the firelight as he stared at the teacher. It was only after a long tense moment that the old man turned sharply, leaped back over the edge, and disappeared into the darkness below, making animal-like sounds as well. And yes, the teacher did tell us how he looked. He said he looked like an old native man who was wearing a coyote skin. He said after seeing this old half-naked man out in the middle of nowhere, it freaked him out and scared the crap out of him. I mean, to be honest, whether out there in the REZ or in the city or anywhere, seeing something like this would mean it's time for me to go as well. So he said he quickly tore down his camp and hightailed it out of there the same night. The next day he spoke to the locals again about what he had seen. The same older man who had warned them before was there. When the teacher told him the details, the red light, the noises, the man in the coyote skin. I told you that Misa doesn't welcome outsiders. The man told him in a low voice, what you saw. It saw you too. His words sent a shiver down the teacher's spine, but before he could ask anything else, the older man stood up and walked away. He wondered how he knew about what he saw. After this experience, he requested to be transferred to some other school, and that's how he actually ended up at our boarding school in our community. Even though nothing happened to him, he said after that experience, he felt like someone was always watching him. Now, if this was one of those evil witches, why wasn't he attacked or anything? I don't consider myself an expert in this, but I do remember what my parents always said about these things, especially the first time I went home and told them what the teacher told us. My parents said that skinwalkers are tricksters, who are here to scare people and invoke fear doing the job of others who hire them, or they can put a curse out on you. Maybe it was protecting the area, the space. Maybe by harming the teacher in any way would have caused more issues. You don't think it knew that the teacher was up there? They have eyes everywhere, all around the reservation. I'm simply saying what was told to us, what the teacher saw. But what about what he didn't see? What about what we don't know? I didn't hear anything else from the teacher those days. Now that decades have passed, I found out that he's no longer with us. The word is that he passed away back east a few years ago. But here's the thing that really sticks with me. There's a rumor that goes around. People say that he took his own life. Pretty fucking crazy, huh? What happened to him after he left the REZ? What stayed with him? Did something follow him? Was this encounter the cause of his suicide? Apparently after I was done with school, he ended up quitting, and he started acting weird and left the REZ. Now, ask yourself, what was that about them not being able to cause harm to non-natives? They say that skinwalkers are tricksters. They are meant to scare. But maybe, just maybe, the fear that they cause can be their strongest weapon. It wasn't what he saw on the Misa that cost him something. Remember, they have eyes everywhere. They will take notice. I had to go back. It's been playing on my mind for the better part of 3 decades. I had tried to forget most of my time there on the farm. They were mostly horrible memories, but bits and pieces of those horrible memories kept finding their way back to me as I grew older, and they left behind a question that I need answered. Could such evil and terrible things exist in this world? I pulled into the dirt driveway that led to the house that had long since been abandoned. The 2-story farmhouse sat on a small hill, dark and wistful. As I approached the winding dirt driveway, I could see the dirty rotting wood and broken shutters hanging open from dark windows. This was my home back in the 1980s. I grew up there. I had left when I was 9. It was a small farm, only one cornfield, small enough that my father could work it alone with some leased machinery. Even though the land was small, he made a good amount of money from it. The farm was different, strange. The land is ripe for growing, Dad had said to me once. He pulled a scarecrow from the equipment shed that sat next to the cornfield. There were 4 scarecrows, and Dad would set them up just after the field was sold in for growing season. They would always go up in some sort of diamond shape. The first one he would hammer in at the north end of the field, the second one to the west end, third one to the east, and the fourth one to the south end. I had always wondered why he didn't hammer in the west end scarecrow last. It was the one closest to the house, but things had to be done a certain way on that farm. You'll see, Dad said. It's a special land, real special. The crops are off the charts for the size of the field. Stop throwing that football about and listen up to me. I did what he said and followed him behind closely as he dragged the scarecrow to the south end of the field. The butt of the scarecrow stake dragged through the dirt, kicking up a bunch of dust. I listened carefully to Dad. Whenever he would tell you something, He only spoke kindly once, and if he had to tell you twice, well, this is gonna be your farm one day, Dad said. He drove the scarecrow stake into the ground. Soon, not this harvest season, but maybe the next, I'm gonna show you how things work around here, little by little. He then hammered the top of the stake that ran up the back of the scarecrow like a spine. I flinched at each of the 4 cracking shots. When he was done, he wiped the sweat off his brow and turned to me, his brooding figure silhouetted by the low afternoon sun. This land's good, Timmy. Real good. He smiled. You just need the right stuff. With that, he started back towards the house. I stood there for a moment, staring up at the scarecrow, its featureless straw face framed by a hood that was fashioned out of a rag burlap sack. Strands of straw poking from its head flutter in the gentle breeze. Something in my stomach churned over. I never did like these things. I popped the trunk of my rental car. I pulled out a shovel, then closed the trunk again. I looked out over the field. It was barren now. The soil had been untouched for decades. The equipment shed was far to my right, on the east side of the field. It looked just like the house. The roof had been partially caved in and the wall planks were warped in places. A chain fastened by 2 heavy-duty padlocks locked the doors. I gulped and swallowed. I prayed they were not in there. I started towards the farmhouse. The pylons were still out, on afternoons in the growing season, and just as the sun turned orange and started to set, Dad would hammer in 10 4-foot wooden pylons around the house, and then take them down first thing in the morning. The pylons had carvings on them, strange symbols that looked similar to what you would see on a totem pole. What are those symbols? I had asked once. I'll tell you one day, but you're not ready to know yet. When the pylons and scarecrows were out, Dad had a strict rule. I had to come inside when the bottom of the sun touched the horizon. One afternoon, I had spent too long playing outside. The sun was a big semicircle. It was peeking over the horizon line. But I didn't care that day. I was having too much fun and was feeling a bit like a rebel, so I just played. I was throwing Hail Mary passes to myself down the driveway. In my head, I was the star quarterback of my favorite team, the New England Patriots. I always wanted to be like Dan Marino. Even though he was a Dolphin player and a division rival, he was still my favorite player. The high-flying, gun-slinging star quarterback that could throw the ball 80 yards through the air. Yeah, that was me in my dreams. But the truth is, I never had the talent for the game. Oh well. But that afternoon, I threw the ball in the air and took off underneath it. Timmy Brentwood throws the pass high and long, I shouted. I watched the wobbly spiral descend, and at full sprint, I stuck out my hands, and I caught it. And he's got it. He's at the 10, the 5. Touchdown. I spiked the ball into the dirt. Timothy Brentwood throws the last-second winning touchdown pass in the Super Bowl. The greatest quarterback to ever... Timmy, my dad said sternly from the porch. I came crashing back to reality. What's the rule? Inside before sundown. Get a move on. Anger suddenly burned at the base of my chest. He was always bossing me around. I was always doing what he wanted. I always had to listen to him. He never listened to me. I was always meek and good and follow his orders. I never got what I wanted, so he could get screwed as far as I was concerned. Just this once. No, I don't want to. I actually said it, with all the misplaced confidence of a child being a rebel. I want to keep playing. Dad stomped down the porch with purpose. He spoke through grated teeth. His veins and tendons were bulging from his neck. If I have to go out there and get you, boy. My heart froze. The confidence and anger melted away as quickly as it came. Now, I was only scared. I started back to the house, running past the pylons that we had set earlier in the afternoon. At the base of the steps, he grabbed me by my wrist and dragged me up them without my feet touching the wood. He put me back down on the porch and grasped my shoulders tightly. He dropped his face to mine. You listen to me when I tell you to do something. Then I got a hard clip over my ear. My ear went numb and started ringing with a high-pitched sound. My eyes swelled with tears. I looked at him stunned. This wasn't the first time I had been hit. but it was the first time I was hit over the head. Now go to bed, right now, without supper. Without saying anything, I ran inside. I slammed my door and curled under the covers. I buried my face into the pillow, and only then did I cry. Past the pylons that had been remained there for all these years. Some of them still stood, others were down. They were old now, blackened with mold and weathered. The wood split and the carvings faded. I walked up the porch steps that said their old age. For a moment, I stood at the front door. Tears started stinging the back of my eyes. It was not the house I had come back for. It was what was in the field that I needed to see. But it was the home that I wanted to see. Because through all the bad memories, there were still some of them that were good. The hinges whined as I pushed the door open. The house was exactly as I remember, untouched from that last dreadful night that I spent here all those years ago, the night that we had to leave. Only now, the home was caked with dust and mold. Cobwebs had collected in the corners. The wallpaper had peeled in the sheets off the wall. All these artifacts of neglect and abandonment. The TV was still there, gray with thick dust. Tears streamed down my face as I stood in the living room. The furniture standing around me like ruins. Every Sunday morning we would sit together there. I was able to watch Looney Tunes on the TV as Dad would sit in his recliner, reading the paper or a book, and Mom would make us her famous pancakes. No one could, or ever will make them like Mom could. They were thick and fluffy, served with a generous amount of maple syrup. If we were lucky, she would add some chocolate chips and serve with some ice cream. That was the best. When she was done cooking, she would come through from the kitchen with 2 plates stacked high with pancakes. She would give one to Dad with a kiss, and one to me with my own peck on the cheek. Then she would get her plate and join us in the living room. I would cuddle up next to her on the sofa, and we would sit together to enjoy her pancakes and watch cartoons. It was the only time during the week that everything didn't feel so cold. The one time that Dad didn't feel so distant. The one time I was not scared of him. The one time he would actually have a conversation with Mom and me, instead of just talking in short and simple sentences, or barking out commands. Those were the only times that we were a real family. I wiped my tears with my sleeve and walked outside, leaving the home behind for the last time. I waded out into the field, the soil hard beneath my boots. I could feel the spirit of the field with some satisfaction. I felt it was weak. Dad had called it special. I would call it evil. The night Dad had sent me to bed with a clip over the ear and no supper, Mom had come up with some soup and a glass of soda. She handed it to me with a kiss on the forehead. A mother can't let her child go hungry, she said. It goes against all my nature. Thanks, Mom. I know he's rough, but try not to get too mad at him. He does worry for you. That's all. I don't care. I hate him. She sighed and looked away, then ruffled my hair and gave me a smile. He does what he can to provide. Just leave the bowl and glass on the nightstand. I'll come in later and take it to the kitchen. She got up and walked to the door, stopping to say, I love you. I love you too, Mom, I said as she left the room. Later that night I had awoken suddenly. I sat upright. My football. I had left it outside that afternoon. It was my only ball, and it was just sitting out there, plain as day down the driveway. If one of the older kids, the neighbors from a few miles down the road, if they saw it the next morning, they would surely steal it, if it wasn't already stolen. And if they stole it, my dad wasn't gonna buy me another. I could already hear his lecture in my head. Let it be a lesson learned. If you don't take care of your things, they're not gonna take care of you, he would always say. I creeped to my door, eased it open, and peeked around the corner to my parents' room down the hall. The door was shut, and the house dark and quiet. Perfect. I crept down the stairs and tiptoed to the kitchen, where Dad kept the front door keys in one of the drawers. I grabbed them, and then, dipping in and out of the moonlight that flooded through the windows, I tiptoed to the front door. I eased back the deadbolts as slowly and quietly as I could. They drew back with a faint click. I waited nervously after each one clicked back, waiting for my parents' door to fly open, with my father's heavy footsteps tumbling out like a madman. But they never came. I opened the door and stepped out into the porch. My ball sat 15 yards away, looking lonely in the driveway. I was ready to make a mad dash for it, run over, pick it up, run back, lock the doors, sneak back to my room and go to bed. They wouldn't find out. But before I could take off down the driveway, I was distracted by a noise coming from the cornfield. To my left, the corn stalks were about 6 foot by then, and shining a pale green under the moonlight. That's when a man's muffled scream came from the corn. My heart skipped a beat. The corn was restless. The stalks were rustling back and forth in the center of the field, and then came another muffled scream. I froze, and my knees became watery. The scarecrows, they were not in their same spot. They were close together, in the center of the cornfield, their heads poking out over the top of the stalks. And they were moving. The corn started moving as did the scarecrows. They moved like they were wrestling with something. Another muffled scream. I stood there frozen, watching as the scarecrows fought with something among the corn stalks. I thought this was a bad dream, a nightmare. And in some sense, it was a nightmare, just not the kind you can wake up from. The muffled scream cut off. The scarecrows froze for a moment. Their hoods started ruffling gently in the breeze. Their heads were shifting, and their straw faces, featureless but somehow ingrained with hatred, settled on me. I was looking at something that I shouldn't be looking at. A shiver went down my spine. I was about to scream when a hand grabbed the back of my collar and pulled me backwards into the house. I was flung to the ground by Dad. He stepped around me and slammed the door shut, then locked the 2 deadbolts. I waited for Dad to turn around with a look of rage, but what I saw scared me worse. He had looked at me, not with anger, but with fear. It was the first time I had seen him scared, and I would see him this scared only once more. Just a few weeks later, I started to cry. Seeing him scared had scared me more than his rage ever could have. "It's okay. It's alright," he said. "You're okay, Timmy." He bent down and scooped me up. He carried me to my room as I cried, and he tucked me into bed, saying the same thing again. "You're okay, Timmy. You're gonna be fine." A murder of crows flew overhead, moving strangely silent. I stood in the middle of the field, the once rich soil now sick, and there was something else too. It was rumbling slightly, as if it were hungry. I readied my shovel and paused. I asked myself, do I really want to do this? What is the point of it? What would it change? Nothing. So why did I come back? For closure. That was why. The nightmares would continue. The anxiety would persist, and my soul would continue to whittle and seed from wounds that wandering fingers of doubt kept prodding open. I had to see if it was all real. I couldn't let questions linger. Could such horrible things exist in this world? Or were my memories simply warped and exaggerated with time? So did I want to do this? The answer was always yes. The answer was always that. I should have come back years ago. Maybe then I wouldn't have suffered for so long. Closure. That's what I needed. I pierced the soil with my shovel. My door burst open in the middle of the night. Dad was in the doorway with a rifle slung over his shoulder. "We need to go," he said. I sat up groggy. "We need to go." He pulled me out from under the blanket. "What's going on, Dad?" "We need to go." "But why?" He pulled me along at his side as we rushed down the stairs. His deep wrinkles and tan skin, his strong jaw and sunken eyes, his pointed nose and his mouth were all twisted in some expression of fear. The same scared look that he had on his face the night that he had caught me outside after dark. Except this time it was worse. I started to cry. "Dad, where's Mom?" "I thought I did everything right," he said. "I don't know what I did wrong. Maybe the pylons." The front door was already hanging open when he dragged me through it. Outside, the corn was restless again. "I'm not sure what I did wrong," Dad said. I'm not sure how I didn't hear them come in. Dad dragged me to the pickup truck in the driveway. A woman's muffled screams came from the corn. I looked over my shoulder towards the field to see the heads bobbing around again. "Dad, where's Mom?" I said. "I thought I did everything right. I don't know why it went wrong." He opened the passenger door and threw me inside. "Dad, where's Mom?" I screamed. He shut the door in my face. He walked around the front of the truck, and for a moment he paused to look back at the field and the scarecrows, the shotgun tremble in his hands. To be honest, I think he would have tried to save her, if it was not for me. He continued around the car and climbed into the front seat. He fumbled with the keys in his trembling hands before inserting and turning them. The engine rumbled to life. "Dad, tell me, please." He reversed suddenly, swinging the truck around so that the front pointed down the driveway, away from the house. He slammed the stick into first gear and took off. The dirt underneath the truck went everywhere. That's when my dad began to say, "I'm sorry. I don't know what I did. I thought I did everything right. I'm sorry, Tim, Sarah. I'm so sorry." I cowered back into my seat, feeling the car bounce over the bumpy road as we fled. My father cried, and so did I as we drove off into the night, leaving the farm and Mom behind. I tossed aside the first clump of soil. Underneath the topsoil, the dirt was gray and pale as bone. I continued to dig, tossing the soil in a heap to the side. Then, I hit something. I threw away the shovel and got to my knees. I reached into the hole and pushed the dirt aside. I uncovered what I expected, yet feared at the same time. A human skull. I plucked it from the dirt and held it up with shaking hands. The hollow eye socket stared back at me. I put it aside and reached into the hole again. I clawed at the dirt with my bare hands. There were more bones, skulls and hands and all types of bones. I pawed and pawed at the dirt. I dug until my fingernails were torn clean off. It was true. It was all true. There is evil in this world. My memories had not lied. I fell back on my ass, exhausted, terrified, despaired. A pile had formed around me. So many skulls, so many bones, all from the souls that had fed the soil. In my family, death has come through suicides, car wrecks, cancer, kidney disease, and also alcoholism. It's almost like we're cursed or something. That's what my friend Max told us. Looking back, if I didn't know what I knew then, I would have thought it was just the hard luck of life on the REZ, which is never easy. But you have to understand that a lot of this has to do with the spirits, other forces and demons around us. We indigenous people have something in common with those who aren't native or indigenous. You see, almost every culture has a figure like this, something that brings both humor and a sense of danger, something that exposes the fear in people, and that would be a clown. However, the clowns that I'm talking about aren't the colorful balloon carrying ones that you see on TV, the ones with red noses and puffy hair. For us, there are stories of the suicide clown, the evil clown, and the clown from Pine Ridge. These clowns aren't here to entertain or have fun, but to actually cause harm, torment you, and sometimes even drive you to suicide. You see these clowns in the REZ, they're dressed differently, not in bright costumes but in clothes that are worn, dark, and twisted, and they carry this energy that you just know that they are full of evil. There's nothing funny or silly about them. They do laugh, just like other forces out there that take joy and pleasure in causing hurt and pain. These clowns are evil. To those who are not Lakota, it might seem weird to think of clowns this way. You know what? Not really, because from what I know, there is something about clowns that people fear. Well, these clowns are a real danger for us. I don't think I can explain it any better than by telling you about the encounter that I had with one myself. I don't call myself a clairvoyant or anything special. I swear on my parents' and grandparents' graves that this is true. My mentor, Ohansi, is an older medicine man who's practiced for over 60 years. Nobody would think anything of him except that he's old and pretty weird, but he doesn't care what people think about him. So I met a coworker named Max. We ended up becoming friends, and he had a brother and a son who killed themselves a few days apart. A niece had tried to hang herself in his home 2 years ago. She also ended up dying, but the cause of this was her driving drunk into a tree. Max was afraid of losing more family, and nobody on his REZ could help. He happened to mention it to me, and I brought it up to Ohansi. We went to Max's house to look around. He said we would come back that night when the evil ones are out. When Ohansi gets ready, he fasts, he prays to the Creator, and calls on all good in the universe. He doesn't talk much and gives thanks to all of those who will stand with us against evil. It's like he becomes a different person. I do whatever he tells me to do. It's my job. He told me to rest up, pray, because we're going to face something very bad and strong. We also don't take much with us whenever we go. Ohansi said that this evil was too strong for sage or tobacco. Apparently it was demonic, from the death world. So we went to Max's house that night. Ohansi told me to watch over the family. That's when he went out into the field alone. It was pitch black, and he was gone for what seemed like hours. I actually waited and started to get nervous, but he finally came back and said, "Tomorrow night, we're gonna wait down by the road." We spent the day praying, fasting, and getting ready. Medicine people have to see both worlds. Those of us who help them must understand that there's different realms that we don't see. It was almost midnight when we left. We walked up and down the road, and also off the road so passing cars couldn't see us. Ohansi motioned me to stay behind him. We hid down in a ditch and waited for something to happen. I had the feeling he knew what he was looking for, but I had no clue. Several cars went by, then it got really quiet. All I remember is seeing dim lights coming from our left. That's when Ohansi leaped out of the ditch and stood by the road. I stood right behind him. The lights got closer. It was a big black car. What I noticed was that it didn't have any doors, and the motor didn't sound like a normal car. I'm a mechanic on the side and know about cars. I heard a lot of motors, and this didn't sound like a real vehicle motor. What Ohansi did next scared me. The car stopped, and a whole bunch of dust started kicking up around it like it was trying to hide itself. Ohansi walked around to the passenger side. There was no glass in the windows or windshields. The car was, quote-unquote, running, but I couldn't smell anything. No gas fumes or anything. Instead, that's when I smelled something else. It smelled like death. I can't really describe it, because it's something you have to experience. Well, something you don't want to experience. But trust me, you will know if you ever do come across the smell. Ohansi then started praying very softly, and it seemed like he went into a trance. Pretty crazy situation while all of this is going on. But imagine a man in the middle of the road at night, with a car in front of him. The whole scene just seems pretty weird, huh? Well, I actually believe at this moment, we were on the other side. That's when I decided to peek over his right shoulder. I swear, if it wasn't for prayers, I would have passed out. That's when I saw a clown sitting in the driver's seat. But this wasn't a clown like the ones that you see on TV. Its face was painted white. Dark symbols covered its skin. All the marks in each symbol were twisted and also unnatural. Its eyes were glowing. Around its mouth it had an evil smile. Its hair was weird, dread-like almost. The clothes that this clown was wearing were hung around its neck, stained and frayed. I don't know what it was, but I can't even call it human. I couldn't look at it for too long. It felt like it was pulling me in, drawing me towards it. I didn't even want it to see me. Having to look away from its stare took everything I had. Hansi was much closer to it than I was, but he kept his eyes steady. I'm not sure what he was doing, but he reached calmly inside to the back seat. There were people sitting back there, making the most awful whimpers I ever heard. I couldn't see their faces, but I knew they were dead spirits. My whole head felt like it was plugged up. I couldn't process what was going on. I couldn't hear, smell, or blink my eyes. It felt like I was floating and couldn't feel my feet. I just kept looking as Hansi reached in, pulled out something with his right hand, waved his left hand over the passengers, and he just prayed. I kid you not. I saw with my own eyes the passengers float out the back windshield, up towards the stars, and then they were gone. Hansi then pulled out a rope with a noose tied to the end of it. He showed me, and that's when I felt my throat tighten up. The clown then began to laugh the most wicked cackle I ever heard. My throat began burning, and I couldn't even breathe. I fell to my knees. Hansi then put his hand on my shoulder, and that's when he started praying for me. He handed me a small cloth and told me to hold it up to my stomach. It felt like I was gonna vomit. My mouth was tingling. I started feeling something come through my throat, but then that feeling broke into a cough. Then my lungs filled with air, and I started feeling better. The numbness left my head and body. Hansi then told me to stand up, and I did. The clown's laughing then turned into a horrible scream. We both looked towards the car, and it started smoking, like it was on fire. Bad smells were coming out of the smoke, like stale alcohol, blood, burning hair, burning flesh, and cigarettes. All of that combined together, that's what it smelled like. The fire then kept going, and the car simply just started fading away. And just like that, everything became quiet. I realized then that we were standing by the road as the sun was starting to rise. We had been there all night, even though it felt like 30 minutes. Hansi then started singing an old song as we walked back towards Max's house. Once we got there, Hansi told me to sit on the couch while he told Max what happened. He told him that all those tragedies were not a coincidence, but it was actually tied to the presence of an evil force. Max then mentioned all of his family members who had died over the last few years, and he wanted to know how this was tied to an evil force. Hansi then explained that his family had been a target, open to these attacks. There's evil forces that feed on despair, pain, and also unresolved trauma. Stuff that has plagued his family for years. Not only this, but the spirits of his family were trapped, repeating the cycle of death. However, he told Max not to worry anymore. His family has been freed, and they have ascended, and he doesn't have to worry no more as long as he moves away and lives a better life. Then we prayed, and we left the house. When we left, I must have slept for like 2 days. I was exhausted. When I finally woke up, I was really hungry and forgot I hadn't ate for at least 3 days. Hansi then told me that I did good, and he explained to me a few things that I didn't understand. He said that he knew I was wondering what happened back there, and all he said was, "There's evil out there looking for people who are open to these things." It wasn't human. The car was not a car. It was a trap. It was spreading death to wherever it went. It was also carrying the spirits of Max's family. When I started praying, it wasn't an easy task, and it was not on my own strength. The prayers and ritual we did helped us out. The burning of the car meant that the curse, or the breaking of this thing that was holding on to Max's family, was being broken. Now, why were you choking? Let me just say that you still have a lot to learn. We still work together and don't take money from people. Hansi says that the way to pay us is by doing right and living the good ways. Nobody from Max's family ended up dying tragically again. I'm just Hansi's helper. as I wouldn't even want to be doing what he is doing. So I shared the story with Ohansi's permission. He said it was alright, that people need to know about what the dead finds out. But even as I write this, I know there are some other things I can never fully explain, as I don't even truly understand. Ohansi says that that's the way it's meant to be. He said there's some things out there that are older than us, forces and spirits that don't care for our understanding. Now keep in mind, I didn't ask what happened. Everything that I'm telling you, all the explanations came from Ohansi's own mouth. Why do I say this? Well, it's not my job to find out. He's the one that explained to me what happened. But if you are meant to know, you will know. If not, let it be. We're not meant to know everything. Some truths are hidden for our own good. And even a small glimpse into this can be enough to drive you insane. We're not meant to know everything. Thank you for listening. My wife, a spoiled only child to wealthy parents living in New York. We've been married for 8 months at that time and things couldn't have been going better. We had a house, a great career, and a couple of cars to really take in the American dream. We've been planning on getting a dog, with thoughts of children as well, even though things were not going to go as planned. One morning, my wife got a call from the police informing her that both her parents had died in a car crash. After the wake and funerals came the nitty-gritty legal stuff that nobody ever wants to talk about after a death. When we went over the will, we found that her parents had left her their estate, a 200-acre plot of land with $1 million home on the lake. We were shocked to say the least. We began moving in as soon as possible. We sold our old house and all the cars and graciously accepted all the belongings that her parents had wished us to have. There was only one small problem though. The house just felt dead. It was so big yet somehow cramped. All the walls seemed tighter than what they should have been, and you could scream from one end of the house and not hear it at the other. It took some getting used to it, but it finally grew on us. At least that's what I told my wife. However, when I was home alone, there was just something about that place. A creak in the floor, a rustle on the windows, the chill on my neck when I walked past the reflective window, feeling as if somebody or something was watching me. To be honest, I hated that feeling, and I didn't want to be there, at least not alone. My wife worked late every weeknight. She took care of people in a home for the ARC and her shifts ran from 4 to midnight. I did enjoy the brief alone time. I would often write or read, or sometimes pack a huge bong and really get into a movie, and this happened to be one of those nights. I took a few big hits off my bong and wrapped myself in a blanket and started my movie. It was a Friday, and only about 8 o'clock, so I figured that a few beers wouldn't hurt. I had 4.5 hours until my wife got back. I cracked a few and made it about halfway through the movie before I heard something downstairs. I swear I thought it was the house playing tricks on me like it's done many times in the past. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard something slam. I quickly got up and went downstairs. My heart froze when I could see the glow of the kitchen light that I know I had turned off. I quietly inched my way to the large doorway that entered into the kitchen. I could hear movement. An overwhelming sense of dread seeped over my body as I finally peeked around the wall. It was my wife. "Jesus Christ, woman!" I half-jokingly shouted at her. She jumped, startled at my presence.
Oh God, don't scare me like that.
"Don't scare you? I just thought I was about to die. You don't think you could have called out to say hello or something? And why did you come home so early anyway? Was Julie alright with that?" I asked.
Yeah, she's fine. I told her I wasn't feeling well.
"And are you feeling well?" I asked, seeing that she seemed perfectly fine. She had a guilty look.
I'm totally fine. I just didn't feel like being there,
she said with a half giggle. I found this surprising. She never comes home early and she didn't seem to make a big deal about it. I quickly changed my focus when I noticed that she had a few bags of groceries. I asked her what she was making, to which she responded,
Chicken Alfredo.
"Oh damn, can't wait. You need some help?" I asked. She turned around with a knife in her hand and she laid out the chicken. She smiled and said no. She then slowly pointed the knife towards my face with lusty eyes.
Tonight is about you.
She said, getting the knife closer to my face.
I'm going to make you this dinner, and maybe later you can help me with a few other things.
She smiled again. I bit my lip and watched her continue prepping the meal. I told her I was going to watch the rest of my movie. I then went upstairs and sat down for my movie. About 15 minutes later, my wife walked into the room. She was still holding the knife.
Dinner is ready.
It's all she said as she slowly left the room. I went downstairs minutes later to find the dinner all nicely set up and ready to eat. The table looked amazing. Too amazing. You outdid yourself. I gotta get a picture of this for Instagram. I shuffled through my pockets and noticed I had left my phone in the room. I quickly went up and couldn't seem to find it anywhere. I'm sure it was just lost in the blankets. I went to the top of the steps and shouted down, "Can you call my phone?" She laughed.
No, you gotta work for this Insta picture.
My food is getting cold. There was no response. I continued looking for about 3 minutes until I finally heard it vibrating. I found it on the ground underneath one of my shirts. It was my wife finally calling me. "Finally," I said, and hung up the phone as I stood up to go downstairs. The phone started ringing again. My wife. Again. I answered the phone. "What do you want?"
Excuse me? What was that finally for? And why are you being rude?
"Well, you didn't want to call my phone, and now you do," I said.
Sorry, I can't call you whenever you think about it. I'm at work. I've got shit to do.
She said, sending a cold spike through my core. "What did you just say?" I asked.
I said I'm busy. I've got another hour of work and I was just calling to tell you I miss you. But you gotta answer the phone like a dick.
She said. "So you're saying you're not at home? In the kitchen?" I said, my voice now quiet and a little shaky.
Oh, haha, I'm not in the kitchen. Good one.
She laughed. "No, I mean, there's someone here that looks exactly like you. She's downstairs. I thought you came home early," I said as I felt my body begin to paralyze.
You need to lock the bedroom door right now and find whatever weapon you can. I'm calling the police.
She said. "Babe, what the hell is going on? Who is that?" I asked. Fear started flaking from my voice.
It's my sister.
I stayed in the room until the police arrived. Turns out she had gotten skittish and left far before the cops got there. They found arsenic in the food, the knife stuck in the table, and a letter with a few words that said,
The house is mine.
My wife never told me about her twin sister. She was in and out of prison and psych wards her whole life. She had been disowned by the family and was as good as dead. That's until she heard about the accident. Now, all those strange feelings I was getting feel a lot more valid. And those feelings haven't stopped. This happened a few years ago in South Utah. My family and I have some friends that live on the Navajo REZ, near the bottom of Utah. Our family is in Navajo, but my parents had met some friends a while back who are. Now, my parents had always told me about the legends that their friends had told them. I was never really scared of them because, to be honest, I didn't believe they were real. Well, we had talked to our friend Joey about coming down to the REZ and camping with him for a few days. He was on board with the idea, and we made plans to drive from Salt Lake City down to the campsite, which was about 10 miles into the REZ. It was a pretty normal road trip most of the way, and we stopped by a few towns to take pictures and eat. But we had decided that we were going to make it to the campsite in one day. We had been driving from 6 in the morning to 3 in the morning, and we were all tired as hell. I had been sleeping in the back while my father drove and was talking to my mother. My parents started to wake me up because they said we were about to pass the welcome sign to the Navajo Nation. I looked out the window and waited a few minutes before I could see the sign, and kept my eyes on it until we passed. I remember watching the sign, waiting to feel the bump in the road, where the pavement changes. As we passed, the back of the sign came into view, and I looked over the backseat to watch the sign until it was out of sight. But when I turned around to look at it, I saw something standing behind it. It looked like a deer standing on its hind legs, but it looked broken. The entire form of the deer looked wrong, and I could see that it was staring at us, and I stared at it for a few seconds while it was still illuminated by our backlights. I turned back around and wanted to tell my mother what I had seen, but by the look on her face I could tell that she had also seen it. My mom explained what we had both seen to my dad, who said it was most likely a statue or something and that we were just tired. My mom insisted, and my dad said we would ask Joey about it when we got to the campsite. While we pulled up to the campsite, Joey and two of his friends were sitting around a campfire talking. We were welcomed, hugged, and greeted each other and began setting up our tent. Once we had everything set up, my mom and I got into the same tent and started to go to sleep while my father stayed outside to talk to Joey for a little bit. I wasn't really listening as they were talking, but I started to pay attention as my dad began asking Joey about this thing that we had seen. Right as my father got to the description of it, Joey became quiet, and I could hear him whispering to my father in a hurried tone. All I could hear my dad say, "But we just got here." About a minute after that, my dad quickly got into the tent with us and told us that we needed to go. My mom and I were annoyed by this. That's until we saw that Joey and his friends were also packing up their stuff as quickly as they could. I asked what was going on, but the only answer I could get was, "Just get in the damn car right now." The scariest part at that moment was the way Joey was looking around the campsite. I had never seen my dad, or anybody else, move so quickly and pack everything up. As soon as we got everything in the vehicles, Joey told us we needed to stay somewhere off the REZ and that he and his friends would escort us. He made it very clear that we needed to stay on the phone with him until we got to a hotel. We all agreed and began to drive back from where we came. It was mostly a silent ride until we started coming up on a wall of rocks in the road. As soon as we could tell what it was, Joey started screaming in the phone that we needed to either go through it or go around it, but that we needed to do it quickly. My dad drove around the rocks, carefully moving the vehicle, trying not to pop a tire, while still trying to make it out of there quickly. As we started pulling back onto the road, that's when we heard a scream, or more like a screech, coming from in front of the vehicle, maybe about 50 feet away. Joey only said, "Keep driving," which was enough to prompt my dad into driving faster than he had ever driven before. We made it to a hotel, and Joey refused to speak about what just happened. The only thing he said was that we needed a blessing of some sort before we left. We didn't want to, but seeing what happened earlier, we were gonna go with whatever Joey wanted. I never really believed in, well, I'm not gonna say their name, but after reading up on them and comparing the stories online to my own, I firmly believe they're out there. Some people would call me a professional outdoorsman. I spend a lot of time out in the wilderness, fishing, hiking, camping, but best of all, hunting. I love to go hunting, ever since I was a kid, even though I had my father to blame for that. While other children were out riding bikes or having sleepovers, I was clutching a rifle next to my father to stay warm in the cold mornings. My father and I spent almost every fall together up there on the mountain. He would teach me about the various wildlife and all the different types of plants, which ones were safe and which ones weren't. He also taught me how to track and how to maintain firearms. I remember the first time I saw my first buck. He stood there between two rows of trees, only 50 meters away from me. I leveled my rifle at him, looked him square in the eye, and squeezed the trigger. I missed, and the deer ran off into the woods to live another day. I felt defeated that day, but my father, even though he was strict, was very understanding of my shortcomings. He told me even the best hunters in the world miss. That made me feel better, at least a little bit. The years seemed to fly by, and I had hunted nearly every type of game in those mountains. Even though I was having fun, I never let a kill go to waste. I would always bring back what I killed to stock my freezer for the following months. After high school, I got a job working as a camp supervisor on the mountain. It wasn't anything amazing. Mostly, I would just sit there and read magazines all day, sometimes having to tell a group of frat guys to keep the noise down, or reminding the scatterbrained father to keep an eye on the campfire. Like I said, it was pretty boring stuff, but I did get to be closer to nature almost non-stop. And not to mention, the campgrounds closed at the start of the fall hunting season and reopened the following year. I had just packed up my truck and said goodbye to my mom. I did this every single year, and yet my mother would always tell me how much she worries about me. My father, on the other hand, would always tell me not to come home unless I bagged something bigger than my truck. The following morning, I woke up an hour or so before dawn, got in my truck, and drove to the mountain. I had my own personal spot I would park my truck at, which was a narrow path that ended about halfway up the mountain. I hopped out, grabbed my gear, my rifle, and took a deep breath before walking into the woods. Around 20 minutes of walking, the sun had just started to creep over the horizon, its rays igniting the sky above me. That was always one of my favorite parts about being outdoors so early. I continued my hike through the terrain, over logs, and through the dense brush. It wasn't long after I arrived at a clearing. I figured this was a good place as any to set up camp for the night. Whenever I go hunting, I stay out for a few days at a time, just to give me more opportunities. I had quickly set up a small one-man tent and created a small fire pit. The sun was almost directly overhead at this point. Even though I was still busy situating my surroundings, I couldn't help but feel eyes on me. I backed out of my tent, my rifle in hand, and scanned the tree line around me. Another good lesson that I picked up from when I was young was to always trust your instincts out here when you're hunting. I thought maybe a bear was getting too curious for its own good. I grinned at the thought of my dad's face if I managed to actually bring back something as large as my truck, but I quickly reminded myself how dangerous these animals could be. I stood there motionless, listening and scanning everything around me. After 5 minutes of nothing, I returned to my tent, but still more alert than ever. Finally satisfied with how my camp looked, I quickly scarfed down 3 protein bars and a bottle of water before venturing into the woods. It wasn't long before I caught the trail of a small herd of deer not too far ahead of me. I took notes of each broken twig, grazing spot, and pile of droppings along the way. Just as I was about to peek my head through some underbrush, a deer jumped out at me. This caused me to jump and fall on my back hard. Before I knew it, 2 more of them followed, as they all scampered past me, disappearing into the woods before I could even ready my rifle. Rising to my feet, I couldn't help but notice the strange behavior. Normally, deer don't run towards a hunter like that. Usually always they run in the opposite, unless something else has scared them first. I peeked my head back through the underbrush and noticed something strange. There was a deer lying on the ground in a pool of its own blood. Its entire throat and chest seemed to have been torn from its body. I could feel a mix of curiosity and concern rise in my mind. I wonder what could have possibly done this. And I also wonder how I didn't hear it happening with how close it was. While I was lost in thought, I heard the rustling of twigs and leaves on the far end of the deer. I looked up and caught a glimpse of something, only for a moment. But whatever it was, it looked gray. Maybe a wolf. But it still doesn't explain why I didn't hear it, nor why it didn't stick around to eat its prey. I decided it was best to start making my way back to camp. The sun was now on its descent, and I didn't want to be out in the woods after dark. It's very easy to get lost at night. The twilight was growing in the sky with each passing moment. I tried to quicken my pace, but I knew I wasn't going to make it back to camp before the sun had fully set. Still, I continued on, trying my best not to think about the possibility of a wolf lurking around, because if there's one, there's most likely a pack around. I began to get that feeling again of somebody's eyes on me from some unknown location. I could feel my hands gripping my rifle as I continued to walk. Then, a rustling of leaves and crackling of twigs caused me to stop and aim with my rifle. It was two squirrels chasing each other around the tree. With a heavy sigh of relief, I lowered my guard and turned back. But when I did, I saw something that froze me. There was something attached to a tree directly in front of me. It looked like a man, but not really. Its body was a grayish blue color, and it was gripping onto the tree with large claw-like fingers. I felt sweat run down the side of my face despite the cold temperature outside. Its head was twitching about as if it were looking for something. Slowly, I raised my rifle towards it, but when I did this, it caused the creature to stop twitching its head and look directly at me. Its eyes seemed to reflect the light from some unknown source. They shimmered lightly in the dusk. I wasn't sure what I was actually looking at, but my instinct told me that it wasn't friendly. I steadied my breath, lined up the shot, and fired. The gunshot echoed through the forest as birds and other creatures scurried away from the sound. The bullet hit the creature, and when it did, a new sound replaced the gunshot. The creature let out a shriek. I chambered another round, not wanting to take a chance. Yet when I did, the creature was gone. I scanned the trees and the nearby ground, but there was no sign of it. I know I had hit it, but I wasn't about to stick around to make sure. I continued my journey back to camp, but when I got there, I found my entire campsite completely ransacked. My tent was shredded, and all my supplies had been scattered about. Just then, I heard something behind me. I slowly turned, and was only a few feet away from this creature that I had just shot. It was on all fours, crawling, still twitching its head as it moved. I could see it much more clearly now, even with the light missing from the sky. The skin on its mouth looked torn, and its jaw was hanging loosely as it was breathing silently. Its eyes were completely white, almost as if it were blind. I shifted my body slightly to face the creature, and when I did, it stopped crawling. Its milky eyes were looking directly into mine, and in a split second, I pulled my rifle up and fired, but that didn't do anything to stop it. It leaped through the air and knocked me down. Its large claw-like fingers were scraping at me while its mouth, filled with razor-sharp teeth, snapped in my face. I was trying my hardest to keep it from biting me by holding it back with the body of my rifle. But this thing was strong. I rocked from one side to the other and used the momentum to throw the creature off of me. It scrambled to its feet, but I was faster this time. I took a quick breath and squeezed the trigger, catching the creature in the head. It wheezed and fell back. That's when I got up and began running towards my truck. I looked back only once, and when I did, of course, I saw no sign of the creature I had just shot. Panic set in as I jumped over logs and tore my clothing on branches. I was just praying that I was going the correct way the entire time. As I was running, I started to feel more and more eyes on me, as if the entire mountain was now aware of my presence. I went around a small hill and almost screamed when I saw my truck. I got into it and drove out of there. When I made it home, my mother was happy, and my father was concerned at all my cuts and wounds. I told him that a bear had attacked me and that I had narrowly made it back. I couldn't bring myself to tell them what I really saw up there. Weeks went by, and I couldn't shake what I had experienced. I doubt I ever will. I have since quit my job at the campgrounds and have started looking for jobs closer to town. I have hunted everything up on that mountain, but that night was the first time that something had hunted me. I don't think I'm ever gonna go back to that mountain. And if you plan on going into the wilderness, be careful. A wolf or a bear aren't the only things lurking within the trees. I've been a park ranger for the better part of a decade. It's both a demanding job and one filled with enjoyment. I'm sure some people out there don't care too much about the great outdoors, but I do. I remember back when I was a kid, I would spend countless summers begging my parents to take me camping at the park. My mother wasn't too thrilled with the idea, but my father would still take me, even if she wasn't up to it. My dad and I would spend almost every summer out in the woods, hiking and fishing. It was the age-old cliche of father-son bonding time, but I suppose it's a cliche for a reason, right? I never grew tired of it, even as I grew up. Eventually, I learned that you can make a living working in a place like this. At the time, I had very little concept of park rangers and what they do. To me as a kid, I just thought that they were police officers with funny hats. Don't tell anyone, but I still kinda think that. After high school, I went to college, and during my last 2 years, I was lucky enough to get a job as an intern at a park not too far from the school. I would mostly do errands, but often the rangers would take me out on ride-alongs. We would drive around in a pickup truck and just enjoy the scenery. Sometimes, they would have to tell a couple of people to hit the bricks, but other than that, everything else was a breeze. After finishing college, I applied to become a ranger myself, and was lucky enough to be selected. It's a highly competitive market, so being chosen was huge for me. My very first day on the job, I'll never forget it, mostly because everyone I worked with never let me forget it. I was walking out of the ranger lookout. I guess I wasn't paying attention, and I missed a step. I tumbled down the stairs, spilling my coffee all over me. I swear the laughing could be heard for miles. Aside from that unfortunate misstep, it's been an enjoyable ride, to say the least. Over the course of my career, I dealt with numerous events. The first major one that I could remember would have to be the time a group of kids had gotten a hold of some fireworks, which aren't permitted in the park. They had set a few of them off, and we were called out to investigate. We arrived at the location not long after the report was made, and lucky for everybody, no damage was done to the park or the kids. We escorted them back and called their parents to come pick them up. One kid damn nearly wet his pants when I told him that I spoke with his mom. I couldn't blame him. She sounded like the wrath of God even when she was speaking to me. Other than that, there have been a few domestic disputes at the nearby campgrounds. Those happen actually quite frequently. People often get stupid when they get drunk, so we calmed them down or asked them to leave. And since they don't want to pick up camp, most of the time they just go to sleep. But the worst day was a couple of years ago when a local kid from a nearby town had gone missing. We were all called in to be part of the search effort. Apparently, the boy had wandered into the woods and had gotten lost. We searched and searched for days, but in the end, were unsuccessful. I still remember his face on the flyer that his parents had made. But that brings me to the scariest day working as a park ranger. I'm sure that's why you're all listening anyway. It was a slower day in between spring break and summer vacation. During that time, there's a lot of visitors, so our roster was somewhat spread out. Not to mention, we had some people retire recently, which actually left us pretty short-handed. I was stationed in the main ranger building at the entrance of the park, while Alan, another ranger, would be at the lookout further inward. After checking in and getting situated at the start of my shift, I watched out of one of the nearby windows as Alan hopped in one of the trucks and drove it to the lookout. I waited around 10 minutes before getting on the radio and telling him that one of his taillights was out. Another few minutes passed before he hopped on the radio and told me that he was halfway up the stairs, then had to head back down to check, and they were both fine. I laughed through the receiver, and I could hear him already pulling a prank on me. The day progressed and I did a few patrols in the mornings, just to take some time to enjoy my surroundings. The nearby lake was glistening with the morning sun. Along the trail, I saw 2 hikers who returned a friendly wave as I drove by. I stopped by the campgrounds to see if we had any new campers. I was surprised to find it empty. Regardless of the time of year, there's at least one die-hard outdoors person staying here, but not this time. I didn't pay it much mind. After all, it was less work for me. Once noon rolled around, a massive cloud seemed to appear out of nowhere. They didn't look to be storm clouds, but were thick enough to block out the sun's rays. I dreaded having to drive around in the rain, so I hoped the weather would be okay. Nighttime was fast approaching as the overcast sun descended. I radioed to Alan to see if everything was fine, and he reported nothing out of the ordinary. The park after sunset was very beautiful. The stars that normally fill the night sky are a sight to behold, and the sounds of the nocturnal forest coming to life as a sound is something I'll never forget. About an hour after sunset, Alan got on the radio. "Hey, John," Alan said. "What's up?" I replied. "Come out here, man," he said. The way Alan spoke was strange to me. He sounded a bit nervous, a little bit off. Maybe his nerves were getting the best of him. "Alright, I'll be out there in a minute," I said as I exited the ranger station and hopped into the truck. As I drove out to the lookout, I radioed Alan again to ask him if everything was alright, but the radio just crackled in response. I sighed, thinking he might be using the bathroom or something. Once there, I parked a few yards away from the tower's base. I hopped out of the truck and turned on my flashlight. As I was approaching the stairs, my boots sloshed into the muddy ground. This caught me off guard, as even though there were clouds in the sky all day, it hadn't rained a single time. I lowered my light and saw that the ground had a strange tint to the mud. What was weird was that as I looked at it, I noticed that the muddy ground seemed to lead away from the tower. I followed it to a nearby tree line that surrounded the tower itself. In between 2 trees, I saw him. Alan, or what was left of him. His body was torn to shreds. His face was completely torn. If not for his uniform, I doubt I would have recognized him. As I was standing over my bloody coworker, the radio crackled to life. "Hello, John." Alan's voice came through. My breathing stopped. "Are you almost here?" he asked. The voice coming through the radio was definitely Alan's, but that was impossible, as I was currently staring at his remains. I snapped my head and looked up to the tower above me. Even though it was dark outside, I could see someone inside of it, a silhouette, standing still through the glass. I then got on the radio. "Alan, are you in the tower?" "Yes," came the response. As soon as whoever it was responded, I made a dash to my truck. As I ran, I looked up and watched this thing run towards the tower's door and begin to descend the stairs. I barely managed to jump inside the truck before whatever it was reached the bottom. I quickly started the engine. To this day, I'm still not sure what was standing in front of me. Its skin was gray from head to toe. Its body seemed muscular, yet lanky at the same time. Long arms and legs protruded out from its torso. I could see the flesh expand and contract with each ragged breath it took. Its face was by far the strangest. Large eyes. The lower half of its face was just a mesh of teeth, some even puncturing its own skin. It raised a long, clawed hand to its mouth, and I could see it was holding something. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life. It said in Alan's voice, "John, are you there?" I floored my truck and ran into the creature as hard as I could. The metal on the truck creaked for a moment before the thing fell to the ground. After that, I reversed out of there, spinning the truck around and driving until I was completely out of the park. I was interviewed by different law enforcement agencies about the events of that night. I tried my best to be honest, but hearing myself explain to the local police that it was a monster sounded insane. The authorities determined that it was most likely an individual who was crazy that attacked Alan, and when they went to go find him, he was nowhere to be found. It's been almost a year since that day, and I have since moved 4 states away, getting a job at a smaller park. Some of you might think that's crazy, but I do still love the outdoors. I just refuse to work once the sun goes down. I try to look up reports of similar incidents, and the closest thing I could find were stories or legends about strange creatures that are called wendigos, the rake, or skinwalkers. I have no idea if that's what I saw that night or not, but here's some advice. If any of you are planning to visit one of your state parks this summer, I would highly recommend it. However, if you're planning on camping at one overnight, please be very careful and never trust a voice when you can't see its face.
In the traditional Navajo way, skinwalkers are seen as witches, but they weren't always seen that way. My late grandmother, who was a medicine woman that practiced the blessings way, told me of the origins of the skinwalker. Being a skinwalker wasn't always seen as a bad thing. In fact, they were seen as people with amazing gifts. They could change into the form of any animal, run a certain distance very quickly, mimic people's voices, and some were known to use magic. During the colonization, skinwalkers were used to relay messages between war camps and spy on the enemy without being detected. Having the skinwalker abilities was a gift. Whenever we lost, the good of the community took a backseat and people began to focus on themselves instead of sharing what you had. People began to look after their own families, claiming property and livestock, and there were people that got the short end of the stick. Jealousy is a terrible thing. People became jealous of one another, wanted more fortunate people to lose what they had. They looked to skinwalkers who had otherworldly powers to do their bidding. Now, being a skinwalker is not a gift. You condemn yourself to a life of unhappiness and anger. In order to become a skinwalker, you must sacrifice someone that you love very much. This shows that you are indeed committed to depravity. The interesting thing is that you could have met a skinwalker and not even know it. They are people like you and me. They have chosen a path in which they will hurt other people. We burn clothing and personal items of deceased relatives, and it is very taboo to keep anything that belongs to the dead. Keeping such items can make a person sick or suffer horrible events in their life. However, skinwalkers surround themselves with death. Skinwalkers have been known to grave rob and search through people's garbage. They use bones and hair from the dead and victims' personal items to create bundles. They place these bundles near a person's home, and bad luck will fall upon the person. Now, the reason I bring this up is because the story that I'm about to tell you is about my older sister. In her younger days, my sister was very much interested in the rodeo scene. My family actually has a pretty impressive legacy when it comes to the sport. My sisters didn't compete, but had plenty of friends and family that would go and watch. My 2 sisters would travel around the Southwest following the rodeo circuit. The cowboy lifestyle isn't always glamorous. It can be filled with alcohol, drugs, and depression. Unfortunately, this took hold of my sister, and she got in trouble with the law. My sister was looking at jail time, and the family was very concerned about what might happen to her. My mother went to a local medicine man, and they talked about the next steps. They decided to have a ceremony for my oldest sister. A few days passed, and it was time for the ceremony. The medicine man and his wife showed up a little past dusk. They came into our house and we served them the food we had made. Everyone chatted for a little bit, and when we finished eating and cleaned up, it was time to start. Everyone sat down in the living room in a circle. The medicine man sat on the far west side of the room. My older sister sat to the left. In the middle of the circle was a large pile of sand that was smoothed out on top. My uncles got hot coals from the fire and placed them on the sand. The medicine man started praying in Navajo and sang blessing songs. This went on into the night. At the height of the ceremony, the medicine man turned to my oldest sister and told her that they would have to go outside and pray in the darkness, and he told her not to look around as he is singing. He told her to keep her eyes on him. The medicine man, my sister, and my uncle went outside. The medicine man turned around and began singing into the darkness. My sister was watching him sing, trying to keep her focus on only him. Then, she heard it. Off in the distance, she heard someone whistle. This made her feel sick to her stomach. Our elders tell us about our culture's taboos, starting at a young age. One of the biggest things that they stress is to never whistle at night. They tell us only the dead whistle at night. So when my sister heard whistling out in the darkness, fear gripped her heart. She was so scared that tears began to well up in her eyes. The whistling got louder and louder, as if whatever it was moving closer and closer. My uncle was outside during the prayer. He admits that he was scared too, but he wanted to be there for my sister. What my uncle saw was even more miraculous. He claims that as the medicine man sang, a bundle came from up above. The eagle feathers that the medicine man was holding opened up like a hand. The bundle gently floated down into the feathers, and the feathers closed around the bundle. The medicine man stopped singing, and the group went back into the house. My sister stumbled in, clearly shaken from the experience. The medicine man could see how my sister was. She then asked him what was whistling. He told her it was a skinwalker, and that he was trying to call the bundle back to it. We gathered around to see what was in the bundle. The medicine man opened up what looked to be a leather pouch. Inside of the pouch was a bone about 1 inch wide and 3 inches long. Upon closer inspection, the bone was hollowed, and more items were shoved inside of the bone, held in place with twigs and dirt. He dissected the bone to find hair and pieces of a shirt that belonged to my sister, and a very tiny drawing of a woman behind bars. Whatever was calling out to this bundle had very ill intentions for my sister. Fortunately, after the ceremony, all of my sister's charges were dismissed. I asked my sister what they did with the bundle, and she said that she wasn't really sure. She says that she remembers being very scared when they were outside singing. My sister controls her emotions very well, and so I can't even begin to imagine how scared she must have felt in that moment. So if you ever hear whistling out at night, don't ever acknowledge it. My mom recently shared a strange and creepy experience that she and her sibling and parents witnessed when she was younger, at around 6 years of age. My mom is not the type of person to lie about this just to scare someone. And also, my aunts and uncles have verified the story individually. My grandparents, mother, aunts, and uncles lived in a small pueblo, a small town, in Mexico with a population of about 1,000 people. They were all scattered throughout the landscape. They lived at the bottom of one of the larger cerros, or hills, that would take a couple of hours to get to the very top. My abuelitos were very poor. My grandfather was making just enough to provide for their necessities by working at a sugarcane field. But yet they were living in one of the nicer homes because of its proximity to the hill and what everyone would say, a witch's house at the top of that hill. Everybody around there stayed away from that house. and the rent was the cheapest there was out of everything else, out of all the other houses that were available. My abuelitos, grandparents, tias y tios, aunts and uncles, and my mom had some paranormal experiences in that house. Most of these were attributed to the witch in typical Mexican folklore fashion. This thing that they witnessed, however, was what made them leave. Mi madre, my mom says that one day she was inside at the entrance of the home with the door wide open, playing with some toys. My tios and tias, aunts and uncles, were in the same room behind her also, while my abuelito was relaxing on a rocking chair in that room. She said she was playing and the door to the house was open. As she looked up, as a medium-sized black dog was walking along the road in front of the home. What spooked her was that this dog had 2 human breasts hanging from its chest that were connected to its skin as if it was part of its body. She says that the breasts were hairless, which allowed her to see that they were indeed the breast of a human and not some sort of tumor on the dog. My mom says that the dog instantly gave her a very bad feeling and she started to cry. My mom's crying then caused the dog to stop in its tracks and look into the doorway towards my mom. That's when my grandfather got up and headed towards the door, as so did my uncles, to see what was happening. He instantly recognized what the creature was and pulled out a small gun he always carried with him because of the long treks he made on foot to his job. He aimed the gun and tried pulling the trigger, but the gun kept jamming and would not fire. He tried it a few times, each time checking and making sure the gun was in proper working order, but it simply would not fire. All the while, the dog was just standing there, watching. The dog eventually turned and started running down the road and into some overgrowth along the side of the road. After it disappeared from view, my grandfather tried shooting his gun and it fired without a hitch. Even though they were very limited financial-wise, they moved out within a week after this encounter. Unfortunately, both of my grandparents passed when I was very young, so I cannot ask them about this event. I also never heard of skinwalkers partially changing, turning, and I found this story quite interesting. Sometimes, when we gather together as a family, joking and playing and having a good time, I tell my mom to bring up this story just to give everybody a spook. In a quick summary, that she saw a black dog with human breast hanging from its chest. Grandfather's firearm jammed when he was trying to fire at the dog, and then the gun started working perfectly fine once this dog ran away. Most of my family, when they hear this story, believe it was the bruja, the witch, who lived on top of the cerro, the hill, who apparently, they always say, was a nagual.
In Arizona, there is an older woman who lives not far from my grandmother's house. She works about halfway to Gallup, New Mexico, maybe about 20 minutes away from my grandmother's house. On cold mornings, she gets up before the sun to start her car and let it warm up before she makes the drive. Her house is surrounded by a dark wood fence, which is about 5 feet tall. This one morning, as she is making her way out to the car, she hears voices that seem to be chanting and giggling. She thinks they are coming from over by this low hill to the east of her house and back from the road. She walks over to the fence and takes a look, but it's still dark and the hill is covered with trees and bushes. She doesn't see anything or anyone, and the voices have stopped. She doesn't give it another thought, goes about her usual morning routine, and eventually leaves for work. A few nights later, she is bringing in her laundry from the outside line when she hears really loud music coming from the neighbor's yard across the street. She decides to be nosy
and walks over to the fence to see which one of the boys it is, thinking that maybe she can ask him to lower the volume some. Just as she gets to the fence, she sees a dark figure step from the trees on that low hill and make its way down towards the street. It's moving kind of funny, as if it's not accustomed to its own body. She screams, and it starts to run really fast towards the young man playing the boombox. He must have heard her, because she says he lowered the volume. However, when she turns back around to see where the figure has gone to, it's now gone. She says that she was certain that it was a skinwalker. The canyons throughout the four corners, for those who don't know, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico, Nevada fits in there too, are populated with signs and indications of the presence of the ancestors of the tribes native to the area. Most common are petrographs and petroglyphs, drawings on stones, the remains of cliff dwellings, and ancient roads which seem to run to nowhere. There are also man-made structures of stone houses and temples. Most of these areas are accessible to visitors. However, they are also monitored by local and tribal authorities, which protect them and ensure their preservation. That being said, it is not uncommon to find graffiti and other evidence of disregard for these historical sites. Several years ago, a friend of mine, a local Hopi guide for the tourists, and I are poking around these ruins. It's already dark, but if you are going to go to these places for the reason we go, see if there's anything of value that hasn't yet been recovered. You have to go at a time you're likely not to be seen. I have gone to other similar places with this guy, and we had some luck with small relics that tourists will buy. By the way, I am Hopi as well. We are only there for a short period when we hear something moving towards the ridge and only a few yards from where we are. My friend takes a pistol from his waist and points it over to the trees. He's calling out in our native language some words we both know and which are generally used to ward off dark spirits. By the sound of things, whatever is out there is getting more bold and coming closer, but we still can't see anything. At the same time, there is this feeling of dread building up inside of me, and I'm thinking too how nice it would be to have a pistol instead of the flashlight that I am carrying. At this time, we're both thinking Skinwalker. But that's just part of who we are as Hopi. My friend then starts backing the two of us towards the edge, running up and over our heads. Just then, this sharp, yipping sound breaks out, followed by this sustained high-pitched scream, which slices right through me like an icy wind. I find myself praying before I realize I am doing it already. My friend is starting to chant in Hopi, his voice filled with fear. We both have no doubt it is a skinwalker, and it is coming right at us. I lift my flashlight and point its bright beam in the direction of that blood-chilling screech. The skinwalker, still in the dark, responds by making this throat mucus-filled sound, a sort of coughing noise. I am waving the light all around trying to get a glimpse of it. Just then, I guess my friend can't take it anymore and starts firing his pistol, the rounds tearing through the bushes. I drop for cover and duck my head, saying the Hail Mary the whole time. When he stops firing, I look up in time to see this dark shape run up the sheer slope of the ridge, just to the other side of the trees and brush. We didn't hang around to see where it went, leaving the ruins behind and getting back to our truck. So if you ever go anywhere near the Four Corners, don't stay past nighttime. And whatever you do, don't venture out into any native, man-made structures, temples, or anything related to ancient native tribes. You might just come across a skinwalker. My grandfather told me a story once as we sat around a campfire in his backyard in the cool night of the Arizona desert. The horizon was clear, and each star twinkling a purple sky, with a full fat moon hanging low over the mountains. His voice was raspy, the result of a lifetime of smoking cigars and drinking whiskey. The fire danced and shined across his wide dark eyes as he settled into his seat, ready to tell his story. Way back when I was a boy, about your age, I lived outside a reservation with your great-grandfather. He had returned from the war and set about raising horses and cattle on a 100-acre ranch settled between a brambly mountainside with good dirt for growing thorn brush and not much else. One night, my mother was sick, and Pa and I took a trip into town, about 50 miles away, straight through a dry desert, over a washed-out creek and some old abandoned farmsteads. Pa and I were driving in an old Ford pickup truck. I remember it was dark out, inky and thick, with only the lights of our old truck lighting up the road. I remember it so much. The engine began to sputter, and the truck slowed to a jerky stop. "Damn it," Pa said, guiding the Ford to the side of the road. As it coasted to a stop, my Pa said, "Stay here, son," and he stepped out into the darkness, shutting the door with a heavy thud. My window was down, and the cool desert air was breezy and felt good on my hot face and neck. Pa was getting water from the back to cool down the engine, and that's when I smelled it. Rotten eggs. Strange, I thought, to smell sulfur in the desert. My nose also picked up the smell of one of those dead, bloated cattle that would drop from the heat and lay there until the crows pecked enough holes in their hide to cause the whole thing to explode. It stunk, and I gagged. My skin started to tingle too. The back of my neck felt itchy, and my face started to get very hot. The wind stopped blowing, with the stink filling the cab. "Pa," I called out. No answer. My heart started beating, and I felt such a fear in me, in my bones, in my chest. I tell you, I never felt fear like this. Not until Vietnam. Not until I saw men dying around me. I locked the door and reached over for my Pa's door and saw a shadow bound across the road through both dim beams of light across the partly open hood. Grandfather paused telling the story. He spit a fat piece of tobacco to his side, and he looked very pensive into the darkness. I realized I was holding my breath and gasped for air. The night was breezy, but I was sweating and clammy. "What about your father? What did you see?" My grandfather, continuing the story, sighed. "A creature." He shook his head. "You have to understand, there were legends. Old legends. Much older than what's out there in the valley. Older still than Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, than the old chiefs and their shamans, the Apache and Hopi and Cherokee, and all them old tribes and First Peoples. They told tales. They told stories about dark magic. Something about a deal made with the old spirits of blood sacrifice to gain power, old power, enough to fight each other and the Spaniards, and later the white man that came for their land and women. They called them." He paused. Grandfather took a deep breath and looked towards the fire, to the sky, the desert, the creek, the moon, the sun, and then leaned a little bit and said, "They would call them skinwalkers." old warriors, resurrected as skinless men, walking on deer legs, with the torso of a man and the head of a coyote, but they were messed up, long and disfigured, teeth like a bowie knife, long arms, and standing 7 feet tall, even hunched over. They would gut the old cowboys and white riders. They'll run through the bullets, part the Spanish armor like it was a potato sack. And boy, could they change their voice to match a person you knew or might know. And that's what I saw, big and fast. Only for a second, it ran across the road, gray and molted, muscle flexing under its legs, clumping on the road, stringy muscle hunched shoulders. And it turned, looked right into the cab, and looked at me, right into my eyes. And I swear, it grinned at me. I sank into my seat. In fear, shaking, I knew my death was coming. I smelled ozone and brimstone. The air felt like right before the lightning comes and blows a tree to smithereens, charged and full with power. I yelled for Pa, but no words came out, just a dry squeak. I started to shake as my grandfather told his story. He was still here, so I knew he lived. But the supernatural always fascinated me, and even now, I felt the force of his words. The real power of skinwalkers was trickery. Sure, they could change their voices, but also their skin. That's why the gods took their hide, so they could take others. Not for long, the legend says, maybe an hour, before the soul of the skin that they were wearing would come looking for their mortal shell before going to whatever hell awaited them. Even though I think that getting skinned alive was hell enough. A minute passed in what felt like a lifetime, 1 second in 1,000 years. My father's door opened, and I jerked my head to the left, putting up my hands to fend off an attack. "Son, it's me," my father said. Before climbing into the cab, he got the steering wheel and pulled himself in an awkward way, jerking himself into the seat. I cringed into the corner. I looked at him. I looked hard. Your great-grandfather was a good man. Treated me and my mom right. He fought the Nazis and saw the worst of man in Poland when he freed all those camps. And now, I was taking his measure. Is this my father? Do I make a run? Or do I die? Is it him or not? Let's go get that medicine for your mom, as he pulled the truck into gear and pulled it out into the road. And our trip resumed. I guess it was him after all. But how did you know? Was it because he said something about your mom? I knew, because out the window, out the corner of my eye, I saw that same beast running 50 miles an hour right next to our car, looking at me with those yellow eyes and grinning mouth. I looked and saw it, hunched and angry, running next to us. My pa kept his eyes on the road, looking straight ahead. "Son," he said, "don't look at it." That's how I knew it was my dad. He knew what to do, and he kept telling me to just keep looking straight ahead and to not look at whatever was around us, running. He then told me that by acknowledging its presence, you give it power. That's where my grandfather finished the story. I kept staring at him, but by this time, he was just looking straight ahead, looking around me, and said we should go inside. As we went inside the house, he then told me to not ever mention skinwalkers. He also said that speaking their name out loud or mentioning them at all
even in text, even in stories, even if someone else is telling you a story, is supposed to make them aware of your existence. A Navajo woman, now in her late 60s, recalls a time when she is yet a little girl. She has this feeling there is someone outside their house. She runs to her father, who is still in bed, the sun just starting to come up. After finally begging her father to get up, he gets out of bed, puts on some shoes, and goes out to the yard to check. Walking around towards the side of the house to which her bedroom is situated, he notices what appears to be a coyote or dog prints there in the soil directly below her window. The strangest thing out of all this is that there is a trail consisting of only one clear print, and beside it, a round impression, which seems to sit a bit deeper. If there was a coyote outside her window, it was standing upright and on one canine-like foot, and something that's not canine-like. While he is making his way back into the house, something across the way catches his eye. There, upon a small hill to the other side of the dirt road, is a strange-looking old man. His eyes refracting the early sunlight, his hair long and yellowing, and his clothes worn and dirty, ripped apart. But what's more strange out of all this is that he is standing there, barefoot, missing the lower part of his other leg, and supporting himself with the aid of a simple cane of wood. This story is from Fort Belknap. Two of my friends and I are by the street in front of my house, hanging out and talking. I noticed down the block, a ways underneath the halo of the street light, there's this dog. It's just sitting there, but it definitely is not one of the dogs from around the neighborhood, and there's something about it that just doesn't look right to me. I turn to my friends to see what they think, and when they look to where I'm pointing, the dog is gone. And out of nowhere, there's this guy, dressed in some grubby clothes, long dirty hair, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, and definitely in need of a shave. The funny thing though is that he's walking straight towards us and getting closer, but we still can't make out his eyes, almost as if he doesn't have any. Even though we were 3 against 1, without saying a word, we all just started running towards my house. Right up the porch we go, slamming the door behind us. No sooner are we inside, it's like every dog in the neighborhood is barking and whining as if they are scared. Then, just like that, everything gets real quiet, as if somebody hit the mute button. I'm not sure how long we stayed there crouched down low and against the wall beneath the windows. But finally, one of my friends elbows me in the shoulder and tells me with his head that I should take a look outside. Not wanting to look like a complete pussy, I move the curtain aside and peek out. I don't see anything, so I go and open the door. Whoever that guy was, he's gone, and everything seems as it always is. Needless to say, we hung out on the porch for the rest of the night. This story comes out of Arizona. 3 siblings are returning home to the reservation for a weekend visit with their parents. Their trip is taking them from Phoenix to the family home in Low Mountain and Pinyon. It's a trip of about 5 hours. They leave fairly late in the evening. As they approach Keams Canyon Highway, they turn onto a dirt road leading straight into Low Mountain. Just before they reach the dirt road,
they noticed an old lady bent from age and walking with a cane on the side of the highway. It is about 2 o'clock in the morning. She has a scarf over her head and a long black jacket beneath, and she is also wearing a green dress. Their only thought is that it's a late hour for walking along an isolated highway, pretty much in the middle of nowhere. The reservation is really dark at night, and there is barely anyone driving on the roads. After they pass the old woman, they make the turn onto the dirt road. A mile later, they notice the same old lady, bent and walking with her cane there on the side of the dirt road. Spooked by the incident and finding no explanation that would provide for the woman's presence, they had been passed by no other vehicle since turning onto the back road. The older brother, who is driving, steps on the gas and puts distance between them and the roadside specter. Together, the three of them recite some words in Navajo to protect them from any dark medicine. Eventually, they reach the highway that leads to Chinle. As they come to the first overpass, they see that same old lady sitting on the shoulder pavement with her head down and waving the cane in the air. Before they can pass her by, the car stalls out and they are required to roll to a stop a short distance past the woman. Desperately, the older brother attempts to get the car started, but there's no response. At this point, with all three of them panicking, the old lady stands up, facing the opposite way, so they can't see her face, and she walks to the other side of the road. Once there, she turns her head for but a moment, and they see that her face is painted black. She keeps walking and eventually disappears in the distance. Now, out of sight, the brother again turns the key in the ignition and the car starts. They make it to their parents' home with no further encounters. When they tell their parents about the experience, their fathers tells them of an old Navajo couple with a house back in the trees somewhere between the two highways. They are rumored to practice bad medicine and bewitch people. From what he knows, the old man passed away recently, and ever since then, the old woman has been frequently been seen at night, walking the highways and the back roads. I heard this account from a guy that I knew. He was my friend when we were in a small town in Oklahoma with a decent size native population. Anyways, this guy, he's not actually Navajo, but he's Mexican. He's the nicest dude you would ever want to meet. He was about 35 at the time. He had a family. He was honest, a good-natured guy that I could never see making something up for no reason. But we were hanging out one night and we were telling scary stories, and he was telling me about the most scariest situation that he's ever been in. He said he was driving back to the US after visiting family in Mexico. His wife was in the passenger seat, asleep. He wasn't too far from the border, so he decided to keep driving a little after midnight instead of stopping somewhere for the night. It was sort of a desert type road. He says he was going about 65 miles per hour when he noticed something in his peripheral vision out in the darkness, out the passenger window, and it was keeping up with him. Obviously, this got him shook. He hit the gas, 70, 75, 80, 85, and it was still keeping up with him. At this point, he thought he was going crazy. He thought it was just his tiredness playing tricks on his eyes, until it changed directions. Instead of moving parallel with his car, it began to angle back towards the road in a manner almost to intercept the vehicle. As it got closer, more light hit it, and he said it looked like a human. He told me it was slightly shadowed from the darkness, but he was for sure it was a humanoid form. He then accelerated to 90, and a few seconds later, it angled back into the darkness and was gone. As he finished telling me the story, I could tell his eyes were welled up, and his hands were trembling. And this was a tough, no BS dude. It physically struck him to the core just to recall it. Not surprising, he said he has never gone back to Mexico in a vehicle. Now, he said that whenever he does go visit, he only goes on flights. I was in prison for 15 years. There was a skinwalker in there with us. A little background first. I was serving a 15-year sentence in a penitentiary in South Arizona. What I was in there for isn't important, but when I was staying there were countless things that happened that no one could explain, and even more that no one wanted to know more about. It all started with a prison legend. They said that years ago, something awful and unexplainable happened in the prison. Every morning we would wake up and be expected to stand near the front of our cells, while guards visually confirmed we were present and accounted for. Apparently, about a year before I got sent there, the most brutal and unexplainable thing happened during one of those routines. A man who had a cell to himself looked very off. When the guard saw this, he pulled over another guard to help him check it out. They found it wasn't actually the prisoner they were expecting at all. It was a totally different man. And this man was wearing the skin of the other man over him. But apparently, it looked like a real monster. The scariest thing was that the guy wearing the skin was not an inmate. They had no idea how he even got into the prison. What's worse is that they couldn't even figure out who the hell he was. He wasn't documented anywhere. And what's worse than that, they never even found the body of the man of the skin he was wearing. Pretty scary stuff, I know. And I realize that's not the go-to definition of a skinwalker. But that's what the prison called him, the skinwalker. It didn't help out that the guy never talked apparently. Anyways, that's what started the whole skinwalker superstition around the yard. Apparently, the guy got shipped to a different spot about a month after it happened, and just about everyone here felt all the better for it. I heard about the story on the second day of my stay. Hell of a story to hear, to place in your home for the foreseeable future. Now, onto the real shit though. Sure, that guy was the skinwalker, but all he did in the long run was get an old Navajo inmate to tell everyone about actual skinwalkers. It seemed like a lot of the prison culture actually revolved around them. Now apparently, skinwalkers are tricky to point out on the spot, but if you manage to survive around one for more than a minute or two, almost everyone can tell the mannerisms. They can mimic human speech, but not replicate it. They twitch manically. They have an unnatural gait while walking, but apparently they got better with experience. The old Navajo guy, his name was Carl, said that he was sure there was an actual one among the prisoners, slowly picking us off over the years. He called it the Grandmaster Skinwalker at one point. Apparently he thought it had human mannerisms down so well that you might not even been able to tell if it was your cellmate for a day or two. He would expect the skinwalker to jump at any opportunity for a kill. But this one realized it had a revolving door of people to kill coming to it. A lot of guys found humor in it. A lot more were really on the edge about it. And every once in a while, in prison, people snap. Sometimes, you will find your cellmate swinging in front of the bunk, strung up around the neck by his pants. Sometimes, you just can't take it anymore. But in our yard, people tended to snap in a very special way. It wouldn't be an outburst at dinner or a silent suicide in the night. Guys would just stop talking, hunch over, and shuffle around. Any friendships they had would be mostly out the window. They would turn into a loner during rec time. They would let their hair hang in front of their face. No one liked to talk about it. Like, if they did, it would happen to them next. I felt the same way too. I didn't know if it was a skinwalker or people just going crazy. But I didn't want to find out. It wasn't clockwork or anything. But every time someone snapped in this way, it wasn't more than a couple weeks before they were, quote, shipped off or, quote, transferred to God knows where without anyone else knowing beforehand. Then there were nighttime occurrences. Short and a loud burst of sound echoed through my cell block during all hours of the night on a regular basis. It sounded like a mix between a pig dying squeals and nails on a chalkboard. Just another thing no one liked to talk about. Even scarier were the shadows and footsteps. The block was dimly illuminated in the night by a few lights hanging from the ceiling outside the cells. I myself saw shadows fill across my wall on a regular occasion. One time, near the end of my sentence, I woke up, looked at my back wall, and found the perfect silhouette of a person standing there. But when I looked, my bunkmate was asleep, and no one was really outside my call. And the footsteps, everyone hated the fucking footsteps. They were the scariest part. In the night, sometimes, more rarely than the shadows, you would hear ungodly, fast footsteps. They sounded like wet feet slapping on the tile floor. Whatever caused them would fly from one end of the block to the other in a dead sprint. Whatever it wasn't human-like, and it was very fast. If you happened to be awake before it started, by the time you heard the footsteps on one side of your cell and whipped your head around to see the thing run by, it sounded like it was 3 cells past you. Everyone hated those fucking footsteps. And I agree. I thought they were the worst. I was released from that place about a month ago. I have more stories than I can count. I swear it was nearly my turn. About a week before I was discharged, my cellmate and a good friend of mine snapped. In the same kind of way, I didn't sleep for an entire week. Well, I did sleep of course, but never for more than a few minutes at a time. Never turned my back on the guy. The scariest thing though, was when I woke up one night to him, somehow, snaking his body through the bars of our cell. For reference, I couldn't get anything past my shoulder through them. And the worst part of all of this was that he was coming back in to our cell. On the day of my release, I didn't say a word to him. Just left. And he seemed fine with it. And so was I. I had made it through 15 years of prison fights, gang disputes, and for all I know, skinwalker abductions. I left through the front gate, a free man. As I walked along the fence for the rec yard, I spotted my cellmate, standing off on his own, similar to how he was for the last week or so. I shook my head, not even really sure if it was him anymore. I took one last look over the yard, this time from the other side of the fence, and I wish I hadn't. There, standing off on his own, on the other side of the yard, was Carl, slouched over, looking at the other inmates. and twitching manically